live them. But what is fascinating, why art? I think that is the dimension, kind of like how this whole brick road, how one follows it and how it pans out, kind of again us begging that question of free will. Um, how it pans out is that when I encounter art in London for the first time in that dimension, I also encounter a language that is connected to art. I encounter the press releases, I encounter narratives that I have searched for in Norway but never managed to touch upon. It's like some things it don't cross roads until, well, I think until the life creates space for that. But why I connected to art is that dimension of the visual experience connected to the language that was utilized to describe. And I think that language was so familiar to me because I have been trained in psychoanalysis from very early age. And it's that connection that offered a promise of transcendence. And I think art is very, very gorgeous as such. And I think that is why art should be looked upon with that degree of reverence as it is. Although I see that constantly breaking, but yes. But remind me what I was talking about.
We were speaking about how art
And language.
and language, yes.
How does that dimension pan out? So, art through the ability to connect the output with the language offers a very interesting insight into the human psyche, or the psyche of an artist, but also the psyche of the society this artist it lives. I'm not sure, like, it's so annoying because you're so inclined to say he, but artist as much as a female and as much as all the other genders that people identify with. So art offers this dimension of transcendence in such a different way than any other endeavor, and it offers insight to such a degree that it's far superior to anything. So within that, I saw the promise of transcendence that I so sorely needed, because at this point I understood that I was highly split and I could not see bridges in between. On one side, I had this energy that was just dragging me forward and being quite brutal towards me for me breaking. And on the other side, I was glued to the ground, and my lacking comprehension of what has happened and how it has happened, together with that promise that I felt art offered, I took art upon that promise, and now we're here.
I feel that for you, like, is it true that art sort of, you had a lot of questions, you had a lot of things you thought through, you were very drawn to philosophy, etc., and you felt that art sort of addressed these conversations on a different level than most of the other things you have engaged with before?
Do you know what? I find art very beautiful because I find, again, we're kind of going to that dimension of sensing. And I think artists, as an artist, you kind of become hypersensitive. All of our in different dimensions. Connectivity with your own body and implication of meaning are lying to you much more readily available to interpret. Always looked upon it in a social context, but I've never looked upon me as an individual within that social body. So, however, I'm hypersensitive to how micro dimensions of this on the social levels kind of pan out on a larger scale. So I think with art, it's very fascinating how people create these things. And for me, these objects have a very clear resonance. They give me a sense perception that is flavored, nuanced, and however, how that ties to a language where one is explained what, not necessarily explained, but how that narrative kind of pans out into that connection where you see A and you experience A, and then you see B, or like the language that is much more readily available for people to understand, how that connects and how that acts as a feedback loop. And that feedback loop is actually what I found very fascinating. And I think, like, because it pans out to consciousness, and I think art, and this is kind of why I say that, like, art kind of suffers from inferiority complex to the science, because it is that dimension of consciousness of art almost like existing as a measure of consciousness that becomes very fascinating to me. However, I have to say that for all the artists that are kind of rushing into science, and it's great for people to collaborate across fields. It's absolutely fantastic. But I think what makes an artist is not the amount of scientific knowledge you manage to implement in your work, but what that work means to you, and that how that work allows you to develop as a being, and how it allows your being to develop.
And it's also an investigation of questions, because there's many ways to investigate a question. It's not necessarily always the scientific way. Just you can in many ways get inspiration from the scientific way, but art still often is a question or a topic that is being investigating through different means or mediums than perhaps what the scientific one will be.
Yes, I mean, we're kind of going back to Plato, that famously absolutely hated artists. And I think sometimes artists have this stigma connected to that. But actually, I want to, however, I see art as a like hyper individual, not individual, but a discipline on its own. Even without the scientific or philosophical dimension. And what I mean by that is that art, if we go to Laco caves, and I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly, art acts as the first as the first instance of evolving consciousness due to the nature of inscription. And that's the most fascinating dimension of art. If we go back to the caves and the cave doodlings, number one, I will say something and you will have to Google why is that so, but most of the paintings found in caves are found further, like deeper in the caves. It's where it's not rare occurrence that they are at the entrances or through the preliminary hallways, but most of the art is hidden in the depths. And I think that's very interesting dimension, because these levels of oxygen have something to do with all of that. But what is fascinating to me is that the art and that inscription becomes the first trace of a system, of a humanoid system, of a living system, doing something outside its physiological and biological need.
Yes, it is no longer an action done to survive.
Exactly. So it becomes a creative act. And for us, creativity is something that humans have a definitely complicated relationship with that, I think. And it's also interesting how that creativity is also kind of almost like acts as a measure of developed countries, because where creativity is highly lauded, to put it like this, in Serbia, oh my god, if you're an artist, I think your parents I think that yes, I mean,
You could say that creativity is something. It is definitely something that is more widespread and much more available in the Western world, since society has come to such a place that in many layers, not all layers of society, but in many layers of society, the there is you are sort of secure in your place to a certain degree, which gives more room and time to investigate creativity to a different level than you would if you had to constantly be thinking and making plans for your survival.
exactly, but it's valued in a different way, and it's not only context to survival, because obviously art is also connected to very to very to the communities affected by social and economical lack. So art is connected to those communities in the West as well, West as well. But I think people have quite at one point really opened their eyes to what art is, like that art exists as an act of unconscious that kind of pushes itself through and manifests itself in this way, is something. It's a thought pattern that is valued in developed countries, because as you say, in the undeveloped countries, this does not, like this dimension of existence does not is not it's not connected to that. And
Well, you at least need to have reached a certain base level before this can start to. Like, there's a lot of cultures, and there's a lot of places all over the world where there's a lot of fantastic art, and like art is being shown. But it always
yes,
show that a sort of base level has been reached, like certain needs have been taken care of before that probably manifest.
yes, yes, definitely, or at least on a larger scale. Obviously there are always these individuals that are born artists from the very onset.
They had no choice.
They had no their free that act of free will was manifested through a different dimension. But what is fascinating to me is that art acts as such. It acts as something unconscious pushing through. And I'm currently working on the book on Origin of Life, that kind of really addresses that dimension of transcendence between inanimate and animate. So for me, to actually see a process of further human development that is not anchored in physiological need or the need for survival, and that can be traced as such, that's a gorgeous moment in human history, and we have documents of it. So we have documents saying that this is valuable, this has happened, because that first act of inscription, that first, like a system, a humanoid system, and again I'm very compelled to say an early humanoid picking up something that has ability to leave traces on a solid surface, picking that up and then inscribing that voluntarily, is a fascinating thing. It's very, very fascinating because it says something about the evolution itself.
I also have to say though that I'm also fascinated by that the means that was chosen for these specific artworks is one that is also extremely durable,
Yes?
because it is actually inscribed in such a way that we can enjoy it now, which means that there was definitely put some sort of thought into preservation or perseverance of these pictures, because they could have just used a stick that was sodded from the fire.
But I think that's what they use.
Yeah, they use that as well, but it's also carved into the stone,
Stone, yes,
which
yes,
means
yes.
that it's a very durable thing. They could have done it so it was much more.
But it's also that dimension of something being carved into something, like you use a system utilizing brute force, like that something is so of such an importance that one is utilizing brute force to carve it into to move solid matter. Like there's so much to unpack here.
And it's also a lot higher energy expenditure into knocking it into rock compared to painting it on with some sort of mixture that would just be a painting on the wall for a while, but then it would disappear.
I think what I find very fascinating with all of that is that those early drawings are quite accurate depictions. They were they weren't realists, but they're definitely yes.
They seem.
Yes.
It seemed to be a lot of things that is from their everyday, or not from their everyday, but from their surroundings, things they have seen. They depict
but
things from their life,
But they've
right?
depicted them quite realistically. So that kind of again shows this level of, or it can show, if we believe the traditional historical narrative, it depicts an eye-hand coordination that is on the level of as the modern humans is, and that's fascinating. Like that's fascinating dimension to me. So me panning, like given the trajectory that I've had, me going into art is sometimes it does feel inevitable. It does feel like this was something that I was definitely created for. And I think even when I kind of arrived in London to work in fashion, the treatment that I received because of that dimension, because I was an influencer, that was something that was looked very down upon. It's very fascinating that a community that should be quite liberal was the one that was actually the most judgmental. How that whole dimension ended up pushing me into the place where I'm now, where I've made art, I'm making art, having my discussions for and against society, and I'm working on a book on origin of life. And I couldn't imagine this life, and yet it seems so inevitable.
Seems like that's what it was leading towards.
Yes. Yes. And I think with that, dear people, we are going to conclude today's our introductory and first episode. And thank you for listening. And thank you, Christian, for being great.